Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is our class for Thursday, October 23rd, where we are moving forward now that we have completed speech number 1, the autobiographical speech. We are now getting ready for speech number 2, the informative speech. This will be a 10-minute speech, so you have double the amount of time, where you are going to be asked to use one audio or visual. So that's one of the things we'll talk about today, are the use of audio-visual aids in the speaking process. And in terms of speech number 1, you should have received feedback from me if you submitted in your speaking outline, because I need the outline in order to evaluate your speech. So if you haven't submitted in your outline yet, you should have received an email from me indicating that you need to submit in that outline. And in terms of reviewing the outlines, I evaluate them very informally on a checkmark system. A plus would be excellent. A check plus would be very good. A check would be satisfactory. Check minus, less than satisfactory, and a minus would be unsatisfactory. So in terms of the template that I used for reviewing speech number 1, that's included in our syllabus and course outline, where 2 different elements are reviewed, the first being content and then the second being performance. For the second and the upcoming third speech, I don't even bother to use that template now that we've got a sense of the major elements that go into delivering a speech. So I will just take notes of strengths and weaknesses. And in fact, that's what your attendance question is going to be today, is you are going to be asked to identify one strength and one weakness for each of your peer speeches, and you will be sending that to me, and I will compile that data and share that with the class at a future date, but more on that in a moment. What I wanted to do was to talk about the informative speech, and basically this is an opportunity for you to teach, if you will, your audience. You can teach about people, places, things, events, ideas, procedures, and you have approximately 10 minutes or so with using an audiovisual aid. And many speeches are speeches of explanation where you define, but they can also be speeches of demonstration where you show how to do something, or some combination of the two. You can also be delivering a report. This is very common in the work world, where you are interpreting information. But in terms of our speech, you are probably explaining or demonstrating, or some combination of the two. So some suggestions that make sense for the informative speech, but I would suggest that this is applicable to all speeches. You want to be clear and logical. You want to limit your points, and keep in mind that the first speech was based on content that you know quite well, which is your own life story. And now that you are giving an informative speech, you may not know the content as well as you would know your own life story. So obviously you need to put a good amount of time into preparation, a good amount of time into practice, a good amount of time into your speaking outline, and I suggest that you select a topic that you already have some prior knowledge of. That's not to in any way limit you from learning about something new, but just because of time constraints. If you've already got some knowledge about a subject, then chances are it's going to be easier for you to deliver content about that subject. Limit your points, because again, we've already established that individuals have poor memories and poor listening skills. Use transitions. Find a way to connect one idea to the next. Avoid jargon, unnecessary specialized language that would not be general for your average audience member. Cluster new ideas with old ideas. These are some of the memory techniques that we had talked about. Use repetition. You'll probably be repeating yourself more than you would in, let's say, a written analysis, because, of course, speaking happens within the moment. Address different learning styles. People learn differently, and it's one of the reasons why teachers usually refer to not just, let's say, oral learning when they talk about something, but they will oftentimes refer to visual learning as well, which is why there usually is a combination of text as well as class discussion. And you can see that this class is set up that way, that I've got videos, but I've also got written material below the videos as well. And use effective audio visuals. The idea behind an audio or visual is that it should enhance. It should definitely not detract. Remember, the point of the speech is to hear you, not necessarily to watch or to be overwhelmed by the audio visual. So think about balance. I would say something in a 10-minute speech or so, you wouldn't want to spend more than 3 minutes or so with your audio or visual. Sometimes you have to motivate your audience too, depending on the content that you're sharing. And in terms of visual media, there are lots of benefits for using some sort of audio or visual media. It's been found to increase comprehension of your audience. It has been found to increase memory for both you as the deliverer of the information and for audience members as well. And it also increases your ability to persuade. And you can go from low tech to high tech. And of course, the environment that you are in is going to dictate in part the kind of audio visual you use. So if we were in a face-to-face class, something like a whiteboard or a blackboard would be very useful, perhaps if you wanted to make a quick illustration. That's not to say that you couldn't use a whiteboard in a taped presentation as well, but probably it would be more accessible in a face-to-face situation. Pictures work very well for emotional motivation. And again, you have to think about how are you going to display those pictures, and you want to make sure that they are visible to your audience. The same with posters. And definitely what you don't want to do is to get into a situation where you've got props and you're not interacting with those props, which is something that happens when individuals are using audio visuals because of nervousness more than anything else. So whether it's a poster or whether it's a prop, and again, you have to think about its visibility, or a model, or some sort of a video or audio clip. And again, think about time and how to balance that with the time that you have. Flip charts, if you've never heard of a flip chart before, it's sort of the pre-PowerPoint that existed in our world. It would be a large pad of paper on an easel, and you would decide when to reveal new pages on the pad, much like you get to decide when to reveal PowerPoint. And PowerPoint is a favorite of people. I'm not averse to PowerPoint. I've just seen PowerPoint go bad too many times when there's too much text on the slides, or the text isn't visible, or the slides are being used to substitute for the actual presentation. Remember, the PowerPoint slides are supposed to supplement, not necessarily overtake the presentation. Or what I call, just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. We are given lots of options with sources like PowerPoint, and that doesn't mean that you should use every technological possibility so that you've got multiple colors and fonts and all of the rest. It needs to be easily visible to an audience, so you need to think about that. If you're on Zoom, you have the possibility of screen sharing. So obviously, you are recording your speech, so you need to think about what would be most beneficial and how to show that. I can tell you that you, again, want to make sure that the presentation is focusing on you and on your face. So I know sometimes you can do an image within an image. You don't want the larger image to be your audio visual and your face being the smaller image. It should be the other way around. So it can be, as informal or as formal as you'd like, but do be professional regardless of what you choose to do. Test your equipment beforehand and be prepared for technological failure. You never know. So make sure that you've got a backup. Again, it's one of the reasons why I like to have a written version of my outline, just so that I don't have to rely on technology. Charts work very well to conceptualize numbers. Numbers are oftentimes very difficult to visualize. Pictures, as I had indicated earlier, work very well with emotions. And you want to be clear, you want to be simple, And of course, you want to be neat. Thinking about things like considering the scale and the proportions so that it's visible to your audience. Use color, yes, but for interest, not to overwhelm an audience. Avoid all capital letters. So I don't know if you've ever seen a piece of text that's written in all capitals. Very difficult to read. Probably every English teacher in the world has read a paper written that way. Save all caps to just emphasize a word or several words. And what's interesting is that studies have found that bolded text is usually more visible than text that's underlined, so that if you wanted something to really visually stand out, then I suggest that you bold it rather than just underline it. Now, in terms of supporting material, you don't need to use outside resources for this speech. You will for speech number 3, the persuasive speech. However, you might elect to use outside resources for the informative speech, especially if you don't necessarily know your topic well. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about supporting materials in the event you found yourself in that particular situation. Using supporting materials increases credibility and persuasiveness. You want to make sure definitely that you're using accurate information. This is my plug for using the GCC library and our databases. And you can see in the notes below in the 4th section, you've got a web link to the GCC library, and those online resources are not part of the open net. They are basically databases that are subscription based. The college is paying for those subscriptions and your tuition dollars at work, if you will. And the idea behind paying for those subscriptions is that they're able to have staff to vet or review the information to try to verify its authenticity. That said, of course, mistakes can be made, but it's certainly more accurate and more reliable than just going on the open web and hoping. I once had somebody make the distinction between using a database and the open internet, and they talked about, of all things, safe sex. And they said that using the database was like engaging in safe sex. Something could go wrong, but probably wouldn't. And using the open web would be comparable to unsafe sex, where you're taking your chances. And that's always stayed with me as an interesting way. And I think somewhat valid way to describe the distinction between just going on Google and finding information as opposed to using a library where you've got librarians who basically have reviewed the information. And there are still books and magazine articles and physical texts in addition to online texts. And of course, artificial intelligence is a brave new world, and I caution you very carefully about that because of the tendency of artificial intelligence to, what they say, is hallucinate. In other words, to give inaccurate information or to create fictional information. So verify, verify, verify is the best advice that I can give you. Check multiple sources to make sure that you're getting the correct information. Now, of course, it depends on the level of research depth that you're going to be doing to determine how many resources you should use. When we get to our final speech, I'm going to ask you to use a minimum of 3 outside resources. And they can be of, any combination. So they could be 3 online resources if you so wanted. But of course, if you were doing something that was much more complex, nothing would stop you from engaging in more research than just with 3. That's just the bare bones surface level, but that's enough to at least give you some experience. And as we will talk about, using documentation in a speech is a little bit easier than using documentation when you are writing. And as you know, that when you're writing, you need to use quotation marks when you are quoting something from someone else. And then you need to give information about where to find that quotation. And if you are working in the humanities, and public speaking counts as the humanities, you are using parenthetical documentation, which means that at the ending of a quote, whether you finish the quote or not, in parentheses following that quote, or I should say whether you are finished with the sentence or not, at the ending of that quote, whether you're finished with the sentence or not is irrelevant, but at the ending of that quote, in parentheses, you would indicate the least amount of information necessary in order for a reader to be able to identify where that quote appeared. So oftentimes what that means is something like a page number. However, you can add additional pieces of information if it's unclear what text you're referencing, so a page number wouldn't necessarily be sufficient. You might need to put the author's last name in addition to page number. If you've got multiple texts by the same author, you might need to give part of the name of the text. If you're using an online resource, that becomes a little bit more complex because things aren't necessarily numbered. Usually we reference just the author's last name. And ultimately, all of this works by having a works cited page at the very ending of the text that you are writing. And that lists all of the works you've literally cited, all of the works that you've quoted. And they are listed in alphabetical order by author surname. And they're slightly different versions of how you would go about documenting, let's say, a book as opposed to a website. And the list of rules are in the MLA, Modern Language Handbook. That's the system that's used in the humanities. The lists of rules are in the MLA Handbook, and you basically just follow them as if you were working with a cookbook, if you will. You just follow the directions about where to put punctuation and how to format all of that information. And things are a little bit easier when you are delivering a speech because your audience doesn't want to be inundated with all of this information, such as place of publication and publisher. So what you want to do is to give some sort of a tag, let your audience be aware that you're quoting something. And it could be something as general as, well, according to studies, that all is basically notifying your audience that this is not your original work. And of course, if your audience were to ask you for additional information, you should be able to provide what that study was and when it occurred and where it could be found in an academic journal if that happened to be the place where the study appeared, and so forth and so on. And they certainly aren't going to require your audience members to be told things like page numbers and all of the rest. But you should be able to provide that information if asked. So you'll see that things are rather simplified in the sense that when you are delivering an oral presentation, you just want to notify your audience to make it clear where the information is not necessarily your original information. Again, a general tag usually works. What I'm going to ask you to do with the third speech is on your speaking outline, the very bottom, to list the resources that you've used. So that said, you can format them in whatever way you'd like, because ultimately an audience member probably is not going to ask for you to put things in MLA format or APA format. What they want are the basic pieces of information so they can find the original source, so they can verify your material. So again, in the real world, you want to share your speaking outline, but in the real world, particularly if you were giving a face-to-face presentation, you might be asked about one of your sources, and then you would have that in your outline so that you could share that with your audience. And even in something like a video presentation, you might want to share some of the information for your speech if you think it would be useful for your audience, and something like a note below your speech. So there are ways to communicate with an audience in a recorded situation. If you can at least try to anticipate the questions that a general audience member might make, that's probably one of the best things you can do with a recorded presentation, because the more of those questions that you're able to answer within the presentation itself, the less likely that an audience member would walk away with any kind of questions. That's not necessarily a bad approach for a face-to-face situation either. And there are lots of things you can use for supporting material, including interviews. But if you're interviewing somebody, they should have a certain level of expertise and in the subject. And we've talked about at the very beginning of the class ethos or ethics. You want to make sure that this person knows they're being interviewed. They've given the permission to be interviewed. They have given permission to be cited and to be identified. And if they don't want to be identified, you need to address that through pseudonym or something comparable. And the kinds of evidence you can use anecdotes, usually stories Those are known as qualitative pieces of evidence, but you can also use facts. Those are quantitative pieces of evidence. I'd suggest one is not better than another. They're both useful. So, having people talk about their stories and their personal experience, that can be very powerful. For instance, if you wanted reviews from GCC from former students, but also facts, quantitative data, things like graduation rates, for instance, from GCC, or transfer rates from GCC, are just as important in terms of determining the quality of the school. So ultimately, it's not an either or. You probably want to have a mixture if at all possible. But again, in a rather short speech, and while 15 minutes may not sound short, 15 minutes is short. That is the third speech. And the second speech is even shorter, 10 minutes. You may not necessarily have the opportunity to use a wide range and number of supporting materials, and that's fine, but certainly the longer the exercise, the more complex it is, the more supporting materials you should use. And you should think about primary accounts, which are firsthand eyewitness accounts, and also secondary accounts, which are based on firsthand accounts. And again, I see value and weakness in both. So if you wanted to get a sense of a veteran's experience in war, certainly getting a primary account, their firsthand experiences is useful. But of course, they could be mistaken. They have a limited amount of knowledge based on their own experiences. They could even be lying or trying to deceive, which is why you also want to rely on secondary accounts about that war, scholarship that's based on those primary accounts. Using things like examples, statistics, testimony, all of that very useful for supporting material. And we'll talk a little bit more about supporting material when we get closer to the third speech, but I wanted to at least briefly mention some information about supporting material in the event that you thought you could utilize that with your informative speech. But I suspect that many of you will be choosing topics for your informative speech that you already have a good amount of knowledge about, so you wouldn't even necessarily need to use outside supporting materials. So the goal now is to determine what it is that you are going to be teaching us for your informative speech and what audio visual. I stop counting after one, but you can use as many as you like. But again, the audio visuals are not supposed to replace, they're merely supposed to supplement your performance. So going back to our first speech, which we've just completed, that is based on what our attendance question will be addressing. I've seen the speeches, but you probably have not seen the speeches of your peers. So I'm going to end this rather quickly so that you can listen and watch the speeches of your peers, which will be the attendance question response that will be due this Saturday on the 25th. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. The difference this time is that you aren't going to be answering this on the discussion forum. You are going to be sending it directly to me in my email so that we've got a certain level of privacy here. What I will do is I will compile all the data and present just general strengths and weaknesses that the class found for each speaker. But your job is to watch speech number 1 posted by your other classmates. This is in the top Moodle section. And briefly send one strength and one weakness of each of those speeches to me. And you can send that to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, much as you did with the speaking outline. And again, I will review all of that, and then I will report back on what was a general strength and a general weakness that the class as a whole found. So it won't be identified with any particular individual. And of course, you would have received individual feedback from me about your speech. If it turns out that you can't read some of my notes, please let me know. And for the second speech and third, as I indicated, don't even use that template. I just take a list of strengths and weaknesses. But I leave you with watching your peer speeches. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class preparing for, well, speech number 2, the informative speech. Take care. Bye-bye.